Hello students. This lecture we're going to be talking about the neuromuscular junction. And as I said in the previous lecture, to get contraction we have an electrical impulse and an action potential that travels down a neuron, the cells of the nerves, and that action potential then it will cause a neurotransmitter to be released. The neurotransmitter will cross what's called the synaptic cleft, bind to the muscle fiber, cause a new action potential, a new electrical impulse that will ultimately then travel into the muscle fiber to cause contraction. And so all this is occurring again at the neuromuscular junction, and the neuromuscular junction is the junction between the neuron and the muscle fiber. And again, it will be an electrical impulse traveling down the neuron, traveling down what are called motor neurons. Motor neurons are the neurons that control muscle fibers and the muscle cells of muscle. And that neuron will end up at the neuromuscular junction. And what will happen was for each single muscle fiber, there will be an axon terminal. There will be a terminal ending of a neuron that will interact with that muscle fiber to control that muscle fiber. It's between the space between the neuron and between the muscle fiber is a space that's called the synaptic cleft. We'll be dealing with a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's used to stimulate skeletal muscles. And then on the motor fiber will have its side of the neuromuscular junction. The motor fiber is called the motor end plate, and again, it's where the muscle fiber and the membrane of the muscle fiber meets the neuron. And the motor end plate of that muscle fiber, it will contain acetylcholine receptors. And so let's take a look at that. And by the way, this neuromuscular junction and what has happened here is critical not only for studying the muscle system, but it turns out that all neurons kind of work the same way. And in our case, when we're dealing with the muscular system, we're dealing with a neuron-muscle fiber junction. When we get into the nerves, following this chapter on muscles, we'll be dealing with neuron-neuron junctions. But they both work the same way, in which there's an action potential which causes the release of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter then crosses the synaptic cleft, binds to the neurotransmitter receptor, and then causes a new action potential. So if we take a look at that here is the neuromuscular junction. Here is the neuron. And here is the muscle fiber. So again, the neuromuscular junction, where the neuron meets the muscle fiber. So we're going to blow that up. So here we're going to take that region and blow that up. Notice here is the axon terminal, the end of the motor neuron. Here is the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft is a small space that separates the neuron from the muscle fiber. And here is the actual muscle fiber, the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. And so let's follow through the steps that are happening in order for that action potential to ultimately cross the synaptic cleft, for the action potential to cause a release of neurotransmitter, and then ultimately create a new action potential in the muscle fiber. So number one, it starts with the action potential moving down the motor neuron. And that's represented by these arrows. So here comes the action potential, and it's moving down the neuron, and that action potential ultimately gets all the way to the end, to the very ending, the axon terminal of the neuron. When the action potential gets to the axon terminal of the motor neuron, that stimulates the entry of calcium through what are called voltage-gated calcium channels. As the calcium rushes into the axon terminal, the calcium, it then stimulates the exocytosis of synaptic vesicles. And these synaptic vesicles, you can think about them as little bags that contain acetylcholine. And in the exocytosis, calcium will stimulate the exocytosis of these synaptic vesicles. The synaptic vesicles will fuse with the membrane of the neuron, the terminal of the neuron, and when they do that, that will release acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. So these little green dots, they are acetylcholine. And so here we've seen the action potential arrives at the end of the motor neuron, It stimulates the entry of calcium into the axon terminal of the motor neuron. Calcium stimulates the exocytosis of synaptic vesicles, and what that means basically is that with the exocytosis of these synaptic vesicles, I have acetylcholine being released into the synaptic cleft. Now here's the key part then. The acetylcholine, it binds to its acetylcholine receptor. You can see that right here. Here's the acetylcholine, and the acetylcholine binds to its receptor. If we blow up that region, here's that little green dot. That represents acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter. Here's the acetylcholine receptor. And when acetylcholine binds to its acetylcholine receptor, it creates a new action potential in the muscle fiber. And then finally, the last step, after acetylcholine has bound to its acetylcholine receptor, it's created a new action potential, then an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase comes around and it breaks down and degrades the acetylcholine, removing the stimulus and therefore we have ultimate control over our muscle contraction. If acetylcholine just remained there and stayed bound, our muscles would always be kind of in this contracted state. So instead, the body has a mechanism where once acetylcholine has bound to the receptor, created a new action potential, stimulated contraction, that acetylcholine is then removed so that either the muscle can relax or the muscle can be ready to be stimulated again. So again, we follow through on those steps. First, we have the action potential. It travels down the motor neuron. It arrives on the axon terminal. The action potential stimulates calcium to enter into the axon terminal. Calcium stimulates exocytosis of those vesicles containing acetylcholine, and that causes acetylcholine to be released into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine crosses the synaptic cleft. It binds with the acetylcholine receptors on the muscle fiber, on the membrane of the muscle fiber, and that acetylcholine binding to the receptor on the muscle fiber, that generates a new action potential in the muscle fiber that will ultimately cause contraction in that muscle fiber. And then the last thing that happens is that the acetylcholine is degraded by acetylcholinesterase to prevent just continued muscle fiber contraction and stimulation. Thank you.